Everybody, I'm excited to be here for all of you to be able, I guess, to taste test and learn a little bit about ground beef and ground beef alternatives and the comparison there and what we need to, be educated about this going forward. I guess the first thing I'll start with here is, this data that we just collected here, it's all relatively new. Ground beef alternatives have been around, but as we go forward, that group of people right there with that research team per se, they're kind of the cutting edge on this in terms of this is the first research done when we start comparing ground beef alternatives to ground beef. And I guess the reason that is all coming forward here, it's not necessarily anything new to us, but over the last, 5 years, I guess you could say, pre-COVID, we've seen a very steady increase in the amount of consumption of these and the amount of purchase that we've seen of these products. And obviously we've seen these come into the food service sector as well when you start looking at the Impossible Burger at a Burger King or something like that, as well as there's some Beyond Burgers that are coming into the food service market as well. And I guess the number behind that we're kind of looking at there is the 300% increase in the 5-year period going forward. So when we look at that and the replacement, the ground beef, people are starting to favor this. And the reason that we need to do this and educate consumers as to they're not exactly the same thing. They're not exactly the same ingredients, obviously, as you guys are tasting right here and throwing some of those different flavors at you. And also some of them ingredients have different hormonal or metabolic functions as you start consuming those into the body and getting that energy, or as he was discussing earlier, digestion as well. When you start involving plant-based alternatives, I guess, to ground beef, you're getting a lot more cellulose. And as we know, monogastric stomachs aren't exactly apt to digesting cellulose or plants. So I guess that's kind of the big thing to take away from this slide right here. Guys, they're becoming more popular. We as producers need to be more educated about this. I guess I'll kind of skip through some of this right here just so it's not necessarily. So I guess to describe what we got here with the retail ground beef alternative and the food service and the traditional. So the traditional is a soy-based patty. You guys have a soy-based patty out there. If you guys can necessarily figure out which one that is, it may be a little bit different shape. Didn't have a lot of time to repatty them, so you guys might be able to see as well as smell the differences between them. We also have the food service, so as we go forward here, the food service ground beef alternative is also out there for you. The only one we didn't have here was the retail one, which that'd be the Beyond. The food service would be the Impossible, and then in this case, the traditional was the Morningstar, but for you guys tonight, we used the Boca, which same kind of concept as a soy-based ground beef alternative. So I guess the method stuff here behind this, we used all the different blends of ground beef in terms of 70-30 up to 90-10, as well as those different ground beef alternatives. I guess to start with our consumer tasting, we brought in 120 consumers in the Weber 111, and if any of you guys have been around campus there, Weber 111's been around there for a while. So we brought them in there and we served them blind to you guys just like right here. So basically this would be kind of replication as to what, not necessarily the exact science of what we did and kept the exact data on it, but just for you guys kind of get a feel of what those consumers had when they stepped in the 111. So when we started looking at the traits we evaluated, we look at the appearance. So what do you guys think of these when you look at them on the plate, as well as your smells? What do those look like to you? How do they, when you handle them, what does that look like to you? And as we go forward into that, that goes hand in hand with palatability. A big portion of palatability is, what you visually, is that appealing to you? You kind of have that stigma in your head. Does that look good? Well, if you have that in your head, then, it's more likely for you to be more apt to consume that product. Where if you see something that you don't necessarily like or, it doesn't necessarily appeal to you, you're less likely to consume that product. And so we also have some different texture liking, the overall flavor liking, the beef flavor, and the overall liking. So obviously we're going to have some diversity as we go through there. We also did a trained sensory panel, so kind of the same concept behind that. It's blind, but we also had trained, so basically we took grad students, faculty in the meat science department. We trained them on this to be able to create a consistency, so that way we can read if there's any difference between production lots. And if that's necessarily something that goes back to that, because when you start looking at these products that aren't necessarily ground beef and don't necessarily come from that one, steer or that one organism, well, you can have some variability in terms of blend to them. And so we wanted to make sure, as we went through the trained sensory side of that, that kind of picked up them differences between your production lots, if there was any, which there really was none in terms of our p-value. So everything kind of traced out there well. But what we looked at there, that got a little bit more intense in terms of the odors down there on the bottom, as well as the beef flavor intensity. So obviously if there's not necessarily a beef flavor there, or if there is a beef flavor there, we wanted to see what they thought in terms of intensity behind that. So how much that, in terms of the mouth, in terms of the taste of that, how much that really hit the consumer. As well as we took some objective measurements. So basically, these would be more of the mechanized measurements behind it. So we had a shear force, the pressed juice percentage, the texture analysis, the instrumental color, as well as our fat, moisture, and cook loss, which relatively go hand in hand with everything. So I guess kind of that brief introduction for you guys to kind of understand what I'll be talking about here. We can jump into the results. So obviously, when we start looking at appearance, across the board, the ground beef was favored, very favored by consumers in terms of what we looked like, or what they visually appeared, visually these consumers, what they wanted to consume. And so there was a big difference there between, the retail ground beef as well, or the retail ground beef alternative compared to the food service and that traditional. But as you go forward, the actual consumer panel behind, or the consumers behind that, actually found that enjoy the retail one a little bit more comparatively to the other two. So as we look at juiciness, it actually kind of gets a little closer there. And I guess the biggest thing that I like to take away from this, there's a very variability between when you start looking at those ground beef alternatives in terms of juiciness. We cooked all these to a very similar temperature in that 160 range, so basically your medium well done range, or the well done range there, excuse me. So we had consistency there. So basically, as you can see across there, moving across the 90-10 to the 70-30, the 80-20 there kind of is maybe a little different than what you'd speak, but as you go across that line there, the juiciness should increase. And when you get to the train panels, we can kind of see how that data actually follows that. But what we need to take away here is that there's big differences in terms of our moisture content and the way that transfers into consumers when we go to start consuming these products. Tenderness is very similar across the board here, and it's for different reasons. As we look forward into the texture analysis of all this, they have different mouthfeels between these products. And as you guys probably consume some of these, there's different mouthfeel between the ground beef and these products because they're not necessarily using the same binders. And as we kind of explained that earlier with your cellulose binder, as well as some soy hemoglobin in the retail ground beef here. So basically with that, and going forward with that, there's really not a big difference on the tenderness side of things. More we're going to look forward as the texture side of things and how that kind of changed in terms of our mouth feel and mouth consumption. Obviously, when you look at the beef flavor liking, if it's not beef, they're not necessarily going to think it has good beef flavor. So obviously, far and away here, beef flavor was very well preferred. And when you start going to overall flavor liking, the ground beef is still overwhelmingly preferred as well. So now when we moved into train results. So now like I was saying earlier, you see how the juiciness, how that gradually works its way up there from 90-10 to 70-30, which correlates with your fat content. So this makes a little bit more sense to us as researchers that's what we know that should be. And the interesting thing here was, you remember how we had that really high food grade, that C, or that middle value, middle red, lighter red, I guess. You see how much that one was before was in the 50s, now it's way down into the 15. So there was a really quite variability there in terms of the juiciness between our consumers and trained panelists. The consistency behind our trained panelists basically found that the juiciness, the favorability of juiciness between our production lots was similar, and going away that ground beef still overall as a product is more juicy. As we work forward into the tenderness here, this is where the variability comes in with the mouthfeel side of things. So when you consume some of these products, you get more of a mush to it. So the ground beef alternatives, that's where this tenderness comes into play here, that when you go to bite through that, the tenderness is basically supposed to represent how hard is that for you guys to bite through in terms of taking a bite, how tough is that for you. Well, when we start looking at the tenderness ratings here, extremely tender is the higher number here, so we wanted that to be higher in terms of tenderness. But with that different mouthfeel probably created that, those different binders probably created that, and so when we look at this, we got to understand why that tenderness rating was different. So jumping in the beef flavor ID, very similar. You get this under some meat science grad student faculty. I think we know what beef tastes like, and so obviously that diverged a lot more compared to our consumers, as well as our beef flavor intensity. So the texture rating right here. So basically that's kind of going hand in hand with, in terms of that extremely soft down there on the bottom, and as you go up, that gets extremely hard. And not necessarily saying like rocks, it's just in terms of the way that when you bite through that, you want to have some consistency to what you're consuming. When you bite into a burger, you don't want that to fall apart in your mouth necessarily per se. that's what this necessarily represents here on the bottom, that these have a different mouthfeel. They are a lot softer when you go to start consuming them, and that mush obviously shows here in our texture under our terrain ratings. I guess when you start looking at off flavors here as well, that kind of goes hand in hand. If you don't have beef flavor, what's the other flavor you're going to have? Well, off flavors. So that's kind of, I guess, obviously you want that number to be lower in terms of the none, and the intensities of the off flavors go up there. Again, they're all in that 70 range, so very consistent there across the board. So this is the other thing that we added in with the trained panelists in terms of the beef odor. So some of you guys opened your cup up, took a smell of it, and you kind of probably could tell that some of these, smell a little different, maybe had a strong soy smell to them, or some of them kind of smelled like they came off the grill like you would at home when you guys make some hamburger patties and throw them on a burger. You guys can kind of definitely tell. And our sensory of smell is also a huge component in terms of consumption as well. Obviously, if you think something smells awful, that goes back to that stigma. It's not going to taste very good, right? It could be the best tasting thing ever, but if it doesn't smell very good, not going to try it. That's just human nature. That's the way that is. So when we start looking at the beef odor, that's kind of a big portion of this as well as we go forward with why we are doing this in terms of labeling and the proper labeling behind this. We need to make sure that we understand that, it's not beef. And that's what the big representative of this all is. So again, if it's not beef, obviously you're going to have higher not beef odors. So when we get into the objective measurements, so this is all mechanized now. So this isn't necessarily, or I shouldn't say all mechanized, but it's all measured in terms of, yeah, we could say it's mechanized, I guess. It's all measured not necessarily by the consumption process. It's more measured with equipment or in terms of temperature, in terms of your shear data, our slice shear machine there on the right, as well as our cook loss data there when you start looking at internal color there too in the middle. So our shear force data. So actually in terms of this, the lower the number, that means the less force it takes. So basically this shear force data is representative of how much force it would be to take a bite in order to go through the product. And so as we look at this, as we found in terms of our trained panelists, that shear force data is lower for our ground beef alternatives compared to our ground beef. So basically the same kind of concept as earlier. This just puts it in paper of, yep, that's actually what that is in terms of this is tougher in terms of the ground beef per se compared to that ground beef alternatives. So when we looked at pressed juice percentage, that's a moisture loss. And as we go forward with this as well, you kind of are going to see some different measurements that we took in terms of diameter and shrink as to why this makes a little bit more sense to you. So I'll kind of skip through this. Just want to make sure you guys understand that you're seeing this right here in terms of our cook loss. And so necessarily the weight or the size of this. And we took some more measurements on this in terms of diameter shrink. And so as you guys expect ground beef, when you cook it, obviously it cooks down, it shrinks. Well, when you look at the ground beef alternative there, specifically that food service one, it actually got bigger. So that does the exact opposite of what we would think as producers of beef in terms of when we put that burger on there, that shrinks down for us. That one actually got bigger. And so that kind of, that to me was obviously kind of a standout for me. That's pretty representative of not ground beef. And I guess the bigger difference here as well, the thickness, so when you start looking at the thickness of it, the diameter shrink there, obviously saw that difference. But when you start looking at the thickness, there's even a bigger difference here in terms of the way it swelled. And so when you cook ground beef, again, everything is supposed to bind together, it's supposed to be tightened up. As you cook that moisture out, it's going to lose weight. The thickness shrink on these actually got bigger as it cooked. And so I think that's something as consumers understand that, if you're going from cooking ground beef to cooking these ground beef alternatives, you got to understand that I can't just look at, necessarily the size of this. And as we go forward through our internal temperature data, you can't necessarily cook these the same way as you do ground beef. And you may run into different, E. coli, different sort of pathogenic bacteria that if you don't cook these right, you're going to get those same foodborne illnesses. So we want to make sure that we educate consumers that are going to consume these. And even though I'm not necessarily a plant-based protein specialist, I'm a meat science grad student, obviously I still think it's probably our duty to make sure that we as educators teach the public properly. So another thing here, when you look at cook time, so we go from our 90-10 to 70-30, obviously you have less fat, you have less cook time. When you go, as it works up there, very gradual, very, very different in terms of the ground beef alternatives. Some cook very quick, some cook very long. Obviously, when you have a different range from basically 3 minutes to down to just under 2 minutes, that's a pretty big different time period that we need to make sure that we understand to get to that safety, to get to that safe temperature, to get to that safe sort of cooked product in order to get those bacterias or pathogens out of our food, to make sure that we got to understand that we're going to have to cook these to different times. So, okay, another cool here thing when we start looking at raw color. So the L star, A star, B star. So there's different columns here. Well, we want to look at the middle one here more specifically. So when we look at that A star data, that basically is a representative of redness. As you work that down and you go to a lower number, it's a red-green color scale. But right now, the higher that number is, the more red it represents. So when we look at this, ground beef obviously very consistent there. There's diversity in the ground beef alternatives. As we move forward into cooked internal color, what we expect from ground beef is those colors to decrease. So what we expect, as we cook, you go from a rare, which is your red medium or red middle, to a well done. That turns into that more brown color. That's the expectation of as we cook forward with ground beef, and understanding how that goes. We've understood that for years and years as producers. As a kid, when I was grilling burgers at 8 years old, I even knew that. You can't necessarily do that when you start looking at these ground beef alternatives. I can go back here. Because you see here how we have the difference in that the traditional obviously cooks down in terms of color, but when you look at those two in the middle left, they actually stay relatively the same. And so we can't use that same kind of thought process as we work from rare to well done in terms of color. We can't necessarily use that in those other two products. And again, that just goes with educating consumers, educating people that are going to cook this product, that we need to make sure we have a proper way of getting this cooked. So obviously with the conclusions, as you guys have seen from the data, I know it was kind of a quick presentation for you all, it's getting a little late. Ground beef is still overwhelmingly preferred. And for consumers, if that expectation is ground beef supposed to be there, there's nothing that can replace that. That's a natural process, guys. That it's as humans, yeah, we'd like to be able to do that. And we can start looking at cultural tissue. That is something that down the line maybe could be there. But when we start looking at effectiveness in terms of cost for consumers, that right now is way out of the reach. So the alternative side of this with the plant-based alternatives, there's different traits, very, very diverse traits between these in terms of the evaluations that we saw. So as we go forward, and I guess the future considerations here, my project myself that I'm working on actually takes those ground beef alternatives and 80-20 ground beefs and puts them into a slider form and allows consumers to add toppings with them. So we're not necessarily looking at the texture of that as much anymore, as much as if those different palates that consumers have, if the different combination of lettuce, pickle, tomato, or just lettuce or ketchup or mustard or whatever that may be is able to cover up those different flavors that throw those off flavors or throw that different expectation of ground beef to see if those mimic the consumption process of ground beef, I guess would be the best way to describe that. So